Today I'd like to talk about another exemption that's written into FSMA and that FDA, of course, has recognized in its regulations, and it relates to seafood. The FDA has regulated seafood, of course, as a regulatory agency for decades. Since about the mid-1990s, FDA had created a new regulatory regime. It's called Seafood HACCP. People in the industry are extremely familiar with Seafood HACCP. And Congress created an exemption in FSMA that said that those seafood products and the facilities that make them that are subject to Seafood HACCP and that also comply with the requirements are exempt from many of the provisions of FSMA. And this was of course welcome news to the seafood industry. Now, what is Seafood HACCP? Very, very briefly, Seafood HACCP stands for the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. It's a seafood safety system that's based upon risk. It's designed to require that the processor and anybody along the supply chain that deals with the product conducts a review of the significant hazards that could be related to that particular seafood, and then also develop control points at critical spots in the processing or the handling of the food to mitigate or control those hazards. It's really a risk-based program. If you're an importer of seafood, then you have a verification step where your requirement is to ensure that the foreign supplier has in place a Seafood HACCP plan, and also to create certain specifications related to your imported food so that you have identified any hazards that might be related to that food as you're bringing it in. Again, it's a pretty mature system. Interestingly enough, in spite of the existence of Seafood HACCP, FDA still samples quite frequently imported seafood that comes into the United States, and there are still continually new facilities added to FDA import alerts that process seafood and bring them to the United States. So it's a system that's existed, and much of the FSMA program was sort of loosely based on the Seafood HACCP program. So Congress created these exemptions. So what has FDA done, and where is it going with respect to regulation of seafood under FSMA? Well, very early on in the process, in the rule writing stage with FSMA, FDA also proposed a rule to modify what are called good manufacturing practices in the food area. And FDA's finalized those regulations. That seems like it's relatively innocuous. One of the things FDA did was they changed a lot of the appearances of the word should into must, which is pretty significant. I mean, should is a recommendation, must is mandatory. If you don't comply with the must, you're violating the law. So that's a significant change. One of the areas they made this change is requiring certain training and certain record keeping about training for people who are responsible for food safety in a food facility, and that's across the board. The reason that matters for seafood is that Seafood HACCP looks to those same regulations, requiring essentially seafood importers to comply with them. So even though there's a HACCP regime, the general good manufacturing practice for foods also applies. So that's a way that FDA has already created a change in the way seafood processors must operate. Well, where is FDA going? One thing I think that's most important is really at the import stage. It's true that as long as you comply with Seafood HACCP, that you would be exempt from the Foreign Supplier Verification Program and the preventative controls requirements ordinarily applicable to food companies. Of course, that requires compliance. If you're out of compliance, then the exemption wouldn't apply. But part of the problem we have is that seafood is recognized as a high-risk food, and yet the import provisions in Seafood HACCP are far less rigorous than the import controls in FSMA under the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And here are some examples of that difference. For instance, under HACCP, you are required to have in place written verification procedures. Those procedures must include a product specification and an affirmative step. The affirmative step relates to ensuring the foreign supplier has a HACCP plan in place, and you've taken some step to affirm that they're complying with it, and some record-keeping requirements with respect to the imported food. But compare that to FSVP under FSMA, and you'll find the requirements for a hazard analysis, a risk evaluation, verification activities, corrective actions, a reassessment of your food safety plan, and record keeping. Significantly more rigorous requirements under FSVP, even though seafood is clearly recognized as a high-risk food. So when you do the comparison between seafood HACCP and the importer requirements and compare them with FSVP, you see this dichotomy of control. My opinion is FDA is not going to allow that to persist. What that would do is create two really dual parallel food import safety programs where one of your highest risk foods are controlled by a less rigorous regime compared to the balance of imported food that has to go through all these additional steps. So how would FDA fix that? The likelihood is, and FDA's basically confirmed this, that after they finish with the FSMA regulations, they would turn to seafood HACCP, and they would begin to increase under their ordinary jurisdiction the importer requirements for seafood HACCP. So how do you prepare for this as an importer or a processor, a packer of seafood? Well, the first thing would be ensure that you're already taking steps to improve your sanitation requirements, your sanitation plans, and your compliance with good manufacturing practices, because that regulation is already finalized and it's going to be implemented in the near future. The second thing would be to take a serious look at your implementation program of verification as an importer, if you import. Why? Because the agency will begin to ask questions about how do you know the foreign supplier is actually complying with seafood HACCP. Another thing you can expect is continued inspections and continued sampling. The FDA has been increasing its sampling of seafood, and I believe in part in order to justify increasing the requirements under seafood HACCP under its general food safety authority outside of FSMA. Thank you for spending a few minutes with us here at FDAImports.com. We remain committed to helping the industry and our clients understand and comply with these regulations as they're implemented by the FDA.